Tirisfal Glades is one of the most sacred places in all of Warcraft lore. It was blessed by a god's death, protected by Titan magic, and designed to be completely, permanently incorruptible. And then it became a graveyard, a plague zone, and the capital of the undead. Today I'm breaking down the entire history of how that happened, starting with the burial that gave this land its name, the Burial of Tyr. Thousands of years before any human kingdom, before any elf set foot in Lordaeron, before the word Lordaeron even existed, a Titan-forged warlord named Tyr fought the old gods and lost. Not in the got knocked down and dusted himself off kind of way. In the died permanently and got buried in the dirt kind of way, in the place where they put him in the ground. That became Tirisfal. Literally, the name means tears fall. They named the entire region after the fact that a god died there, which is, you know, not the most uplifting origin story for a neighborhood. But here's the thing. Tyr's death didn't just leave a body in the ground. It consecrated the land itself. His burial turned Tirisfal into one of the most magically potent locations on the entire planet. The soil, the trees, the air, all of it was saturated with residual Titan energy so powerful that it actively repelled undead magic and demonic corruption. For thousands of years, nothing dark could take root there. The land itself would reject it. The Titans recognized what Tyr's sacrifice had created and designated the entire region as a sacred refuge, a place specifically meant to stay pure, a permanent ward against the forces of darkness. And for a very long time, that's exactly what it was. Tirisfal Glades was untouchable. A holy sanctuary built on the bones of a fallen god, radiating protective magic like a nightlight that could obliterate demons. This is important because every single thing that happens in this video is the story of that protection being slowly, systematically dismantled. Every civilization that settled here came because they felt that power, and every catastrophe that followed happened because somebody found a way to break it. But before the breaking came the building, and the first ones to show up were the High Elves. Arrival of the High Elves, roughly 6,800 years before the First War. The High Elves showed up in Tirisfal Glades, and honestly, you can't blame them. The region was practically humming with arcane energy, ley lines running through the earth like veins of pure magic, all of it radiating from Tyr's ancient resting place. For a civilization of magic-obsessed immortals, finding Tirisfal must have felt like stumbling into an all-you-can-eat buffet. So naturally, they sat down and started eating. Here's the thing though, they didn't just move in and admire the scenery. Elven mages began tapping into the ley lines, pulling on threads of power that had been sitting undisturbed for thousands of years. They had every intention of making this place home. But something was wrong. A creeping madness started working its way through the settlement, dark whispers, paranoia, corruption seeping up from beneath the earth. The elves didn't know it at the time, but the ancient evil buried below Tirisfal was pushing back. So they packed up and left, heading north to found Quel'Thalas instead. Sounds like a clean exit, right? Problem detected, problem avoided, beautiful stuff. But here's where it gets complicated. Some fans, and honestly the lore kind of supports this, argue that the High Elves tampering with those ley lines during their brief stay was the first crack in Tirisfal's armor. Tyr's burial had created a natural barrier against corruption, a passive protection that had held for millennia without anyone needing to touch it. The elves didn't just study the ley lines, they disturbed them, pulled power from a system that was never designed to be pulled from, and then they left the whole thing exposed when they fled north. And the irony is almost poetic. Thousands of years later, when the Council of Tirisfal finally formed to train guardians against demonic threats, it was built on elven and human magical cooperation in the very region the elves had originally abandoned because it felt wrong. The arcane traditions they helped spark would eventually be twisted into necromancy, the very school of magic that destroyed everything those traditions were meant to protect. They walked into a sacred place, rearranged the furniture, sensed something terrible, left, and unknowingly left the front door unlocked for every horror that followed, which is, you know, not ideal. But if the elves cracked the foundation, it was the humans who built an entire kingdom on top of it. The founding of Lordaeron, this wasn't some group of settlers stumbling onto a nice patch of grass and deciding to build a few houses. The humans who founded Lordaeron knew exactly what they were doing. They chose Tirisfal Glades on purpose, specifically because a dead god was buried underneath it. And honestly, that's the most human thing I've ever heard. Hey, there's a Titan warlord's corpse radiating holy energy into the soil here. Let's build a city on top of it. Can't argue with the logic. Around 2,700 700 years before the First War, human settlers established what would become the single most powerful kingdom on Azeroth. Lord Aaron City rose as the capital, positioned right in the heart of Tirisfal Glades, directly above Tyr's ancient resting place. The location wasn't strategic in the military sense, it was strategic in the "we're literally building our civilization on consecrated ground" sense, every brick laid on top of a blessing. And here's what made Lord Aaron special. It wasn't just a human kingdom. Like, the High Elves who had already settled in the region were absorbed peacefully into the growing state. No wars, no forced assimilation, just a genuine multiracial civilization cooperating under one banner. Humans and elves sharing knowledge, sharing magic, sharing a homeland. Within 500 years, Lordaeron wasn't just powerful, it was the most powerful human kingdom on the entire planet. Tirisfal Glades became both the spiritual and political heart of everything, the seat of kings, the center of arcane learning, a beacon of stability for the whole continent. If you were alive on Azeroth during this era, Lordaeron was the safest, most prosperous place you could possibly be. Built on sacred ground, protected by ancient power, governed by a civilization that genuinely seemed to have figured it out. This is what fans talk about when they mention the Golden Age. Pre-Third War, Lordaeron represents everything the franchise's lore does best. A kingdom that felt permanent, a civilization built on the grave of a god who died protecting the world, carrying that legacy forward into something beautiful and enduring. It seemed destined to last forever. It didn't. But before we get to why, we need to talk about the secret order of mages who were quietly pulling the strings behind Lord Aaron's throne. The rise of the Order of Tirisfal. Around 2,600 years before the First War, the most powerful mages on Azeroth looked at the growing demonic threat and decided to do something about it. Quietly. No armies, no proclamations, no banners. Like, just a secret society of human and elven mages operating from the shadows with one singular mission: protect the world from threats too dangerous for ordinary people to even know about. And where did they set up shop? Tirisfal Glades. Obviously, the region's magical ley lines and Tyr's ancient residual power made it the perfect sanctuary. The Order drew strength directly from the land itself, turning Tirisfal into both a fortress and a battery. But here's where it gets interesting. The Order didn't operate as a committee. They funneled their combined magical power into a single chosen champion called the Guardian. One person, one vessel for the collective strength of the greatest mages alive. That made the Guardian one of the most powerful beings walking the planet at any given time. For millennia, this system worked. Guardians rose, or fought back demonic incursions nobody ever heard about, and passed the mantle to the next worthy candidate. Clean, efficient, secret. The people of Lord Aaron slept peacefully in their beds, having zero idea that a shadow war was being fought on their behalf by a single overpowered mage operating out of their backyard. Then came Medivh. Medivh was the last Guardian, inheriting the role roughly 30 years before the First War. He was brilliant, impossibly powerful, and by all accounts exactly the kind of person you'd want protecting reality. One small problem: before Medivh was even born, the Dark Titan Sargeras had already planted his essence inside him. The Guardian, the Order's greatest weapon, was compromised from day one, so while the Order believed their champion was out there safeguarding Azeroth, Medivh was secretly opening the Dark Portal and inviting the Orcish horde to invade. The very catastrophe the Order existed to prevent was caused by their own chosen protector. Some fans argue Medivh was a puppet with no real agency, fully possessed and unaware. Others believe there were moments where the real Medivh surfaced and made choices, which honestly makes the whole thing worse. Either way, the result is the same. The Order of Tirisfal, this ancient institution built on secrecy and concentrated power, became the single greatest failure in Azeroth's history. Their sanctuary in Tirisfal Glades didn't protect anyone. Their Guardian didn't guard anything, and the land that was supposed to be a shield became the staging ground for everything that followed. If you think Medivh's betrayal was the worst thing to happen to this region, like the Second War is about to prove you very, very wrong. The Second War. On paper, Lordaeron won the Second War, and that single fact might be the cruelest thing in this entire story. The Second War lasted roughly 3 years, and for most of that time, Tirisfal Glades was a war zone. Orc forces pushed directly into Lord Aaron's heartland, burning settlements, destroying fortifications, and carving a path of destruction through the very region that had been considered untouchable for millennia. Towns that had stood for generations were reduced to rubble. Farmland that fed the kingdom was scorched. Military outposts that had never seen real combat were overrun in days. But the Horde never took Lord Aaron City itself. The capital held, the Alliance rallied, pushed back, and eventually forced a full orc retreat. Victory, celebrations, the kingdom survived. Here's the thing though, survival and recovery are not the same thing. The cost of winning was staggering. Lord Aaron's military was gutted. Like entire regiments were wiped out defending ground they'd eventually retake anyway. The kingdom's economy, built on agriculture and trade routes that now ran through devastated countryside, was crippled, and the spiritual toll was arguably worse than either of those. People had watched their neighbors die. They'd seen their sacred land violated by an enemy that shouldn't have existed. The confidence that Lord Aaron was protected, that feeling of divine safety that had persisted since Tyr's burial, was shattered. And then there's Medivh. The last guardian of the Order of Tirisfal had already been killed at the end of the First War. The single most powerful magical protector the region had ever known. The living embodiment of thousands of years of arcane defense was already gone before the Second War even started. No replacement, no succession plan. The Order of Tirisfal, which had shielded this land from demonic and magical threats for over 2,600 years, effectively ceased to function. The magical safeguard that had been running in the background since before most humans could read was just switched off, like unplugging a smoke detector because the battery was annoying. So let's take inventory. Depleted military, broken economy, traumatized population, zero magical protection, and a kingdom that genuinely believed the worst was over because they technically won. That's the real horror of the Second War, not what the orcs did to Lord Aaron, but what victory did to Lord Aaron. It created the illusion of safety in a kingdom that had never been more vulnerable. Every resource spent repelling the Horde was a resource that wouldn't be there when the next threat arrived. Every soldier buried in Tirisfal soil was one fewer body standing between the capital and whatever came next. The kingdom had maybe 15 years to recover before that next threat showed up. Sounds like a lot. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. But if you think a weakened kingdom sounds bad, wait until you hear what walked through its gates next. The fall of Lord Aaron. Everything you've just heard about, every layer of protection, every ancient blessing, every secret order of mages, every kingdom built on sacred ground, gone, all of it. In weeks, the undead plague arrived in Lord Aaron roughly 6 or 7 years after the Second War, and it moved through the population like wildfire through dry grass. The Lich King's agents had been seeding infected grain throughout the northern villages, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, hundreds of thousands were already dead or dying. Not wounded, not sick. Dead, and then standing back up again. Entire towns turned overnight. Families sat down to dinner, and by morning they were shambling corpses looking for the next village to consume. But here's the thing. Lord Aaron wasn't some backwater settlement with no defenses. This was a civilization that had stood for nearly 3,000 years. It had survived the Troll Wars, it had survived the Horde, it had the blessing of a literal Titan Keeper buried beneath its soil. And none of it mattered. Prince Arthas Menethil, the kingdom's golden boy, its future king, rode north to stop the plague. He came back as its weapon. The Lich King's corruption took him piece by piece, first his judgment, then his mercy, then his soul. By the time Arthas returned to Lord Aaron City, he wasn't a prince anymore. He was a Death Knight wearing a prince's face. He walked into the throne room, knelt before his father, King Tyrannus, and murdered him, ran him through while the court watched. "My son, what are you doing? Succeeding you, father." And that was it. That was the end of Lord Aaron. The kingdom collapsed within months of the plague's first appearance. 3 millennia of history, of culture, of magical tradition, erased in less time than it takes to grow a crop of wheat. Tirisfal Glades, the land Tyr died to protect, the sanctuary that had drawn the High Elves, the seat of the most powerful order of mages on Azeroth, became a graveyard. Not metaphorically, literally a graveyard. Every field, every road, every chapel filled with the walking dead. And that raises a question that fans have been arguing about for years. If Tyr's Titan-forged protection couldn't stop the plague, what was it actually protecting against? Was the old god's corruption always the stronger force quietly eating away at the land's defenses from below, while everyone was busy fighting orcs and trolls above? Or had the Order of Tirisfal's destruction already hollowed out the region's magical immune system, leaving it defenseless when the real threat finally showed up? Some players argue the Order could have stopped Arthas, that a guardian, a real one. Amai would have sensed the plague for what it was and burned it out before it spread. Others say it wouldn't have changed a thing. The Lich King was operating on a level that made the Order's magic look like party tricks. As for Arthas himself, the sympathy debate never ends. He was a young man trying to save his people, who got consumed by the very evil he was fighting. Tragic, sure. But he also butchered his own father in cold blood, and led the genocide of his entire kingdom. At a certain point, the tragedy stops being an excuse and starts being a backstory, but the dead of Lordaeron weren't done, not by a long shot, because some of them woke up and they remembered everything, the birth of the Forsaken. Here's the thing about the Forsaken that most people get wrong. They weren't invaders. Like, they weren't some foreign army that marched into Tirisfal Glades and claimed it. They were Lordaeron, the same farmers, soldiers, merchants, and nobles who had lived there for generations. They just happened to be dead now. Shortly after the fall of Lordaeron, while the Scourge was still tearing across the continent, Sylvanas Windrunner did something that should have been impossible. She broke free from the Lich King's control and took thousands of undead with her. These weren't mindless ghouls, they were people, former citizens of Lordaeron who retained their memories, their identities, their personalities. They remembered their families, they remembered their homes, they remembered dying, and then they looked around and realized nobody wanted them. The living recoiled in horror. The Lich King wanted them back under his boot. The Scarlet Crusade wanted them permanently dead. So Sylvanas made a choice. If nobody would give the free-willed undead a place in the world, they'd take one. And what better place than the kingdom that was already theirs? The Forsaken established the Undercity as their capital, built directly beneath the ruins of Lordaeron's capital city. Think about that for a second. These were people walking the same halls where they'd once held court, raised children, celebrated holidays, except now those halls were tombs and they were the corpses. They built a functioning civilization in the sewers and crypts underneath their own destroyed capital. Meeting rooms where throne rooms used to be, apothecary labs where gardens once grew. Is like moving back into your childhood home, except the roof is caved in and you're a skeleton. Not ideal. But here's where the moral complexity kicks in, and it's the reason the Forsaken remain one of WoW's most debated factions to this day. Tirisfal Glades became their primary territory and cultural heartland. The same land that Tyr had blessed and sanctified thousands of years ago, the same sacred ground that had repelled corruption for millennia. Now it belonged to the undead. Is that desecration? Or is it defiance? Because you can frame it either way. On one hand, the Walking Dead claiming a Titan's holy sanctuary as their personal kingdom is about as blasphemous as it gets. On the other hand, these people didn't ask to die. They didn't ask to come back. They were victims of the plague, victims of Arthas, victims of forces so far beyond their control, it's almost laughable. And when the entire world told them they were abominations who deserved to be put down, they said no. They dug into the ruins of their own graves and built something new. Tirisfal Glades became a grim mirror of everything it had once been. The forests were still there, but rotting. The buildings were still there, but crumbling. The people were still there, but dead. It was Lordaeron in every way that mattered, just filtered through a layer of decay and blight that made the whole thing feel like a photograph left in water too long. Recognizable, but wrong. The Forsaken's numbers grew into the tens of thousands, and every single one of them carried the weight of remembering who they used to be. That's not an army of monsters. That's a nation of ghosts who refused to lie down. But nations, especially ones built on defiance and rage, have a tendency to attract attention, and the attention Tirisfal was about to receive would make the plague look like a warm-up. The battle for Azeroth, the siege of Lordaeron. For years, the Forsaken had been squatting in the ruins of a kingdom they once belonged to, building something that resembled a home. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't warm, but it was theirs. And in 2018, during the Battle for Azeroth expansion, the Alliance decided they wanted it back. The Siege of Lordaeron was the opening salvo of an entire expansion built around faction war, and it turned Tirisfal Glades into a war zone for the second time in its history. Alliance forces marched on the Undercity with one goal: reclaim the ruins of their former capital and drive the Forsaken out for good. This wasn't a skirmish. This was a full-scale military assault, complete with siege engines, aerial bombardments, and enough named characters on the battlefield to fill a phone book. But here's where it gets ugly. Rather than surrender the city, rather than retreat and regroup, Sylvanas Windrunner made a decision that would define her legacy for years to come. She ordered the Blight deployed, not against the Alliance, against everything. The Undercity, the surrounding tunnels, the ruins above, all of it. She flooded her own capital with the same category of chemical weapon that had killed every single person living there the first time around. Let that sink in for a second. These were people who died to the plague of undeath. They were raised against their will, clawed their way to free will, built an entire civilization in the sewers beneath beneath their own graves, and then their leader poisoned the whole thing with essentially the same substance that murdered them. And the weapon that destroyed Lordaeron the first time was now being wielded by Lordaeron's own undead citizens against themselves. That's not irony, that's a cycle of self-destruction so complete it almost feels intentional. And the thing is, Sylvanas didn't do this as a last resort. She did it as a strategy. The Blight wasn't a desperate measure, it was the plan. Deny the Alliance their victory by making sure there was nothing left to win. Scorched Earth, except the Earth was already dead, and she scorched it anyway. The result was total displacement. The Forsaken lost their capital. The Undercity, which had been a functional horde hub since the original game launched in 2004, was gone. 14 years of player history, quest lines, right, and faction identity blighted into nothing. Tirisfal Glades became more desolate than it had been at any point in its entire history, and that's saying something for a region that's been through a Titan burial, an undead plague, and 2 wars. Like, players were furious, and not just Alliance players celebrating a win. Horde players, specifically Forsaken loyalists, felt genuinely betrayed. They'd spent years defending Sylvanas' morally gray decisions, arguing she was pragmatic rather than evil, and then she gassed her own people's home without blinking. The forums erupted, the subreddit erupted. Morally gray became a meme that Blizzard would never live down. The cruelest part is that nobody won. The Alliance couldn't use the city because it was contaminated beyond recovery. The Forsaken couldn't return because their own leader made sure of that. Tirisfal Glades, the land blessed by a Titan, the heart of humanity's greatest kingdom, the last refuge of the undead, was now just poison. A monument to the fact that everything this region touches eventually destroys itself. But the Blight didn't stop at the Undercity walls, it spread outward into the surrounding countryside, and what it did to the town of Brill might be even worse. The blighting of Brill. Not every tragedy in Tirisfal Glades came with a cinematic. Some of them just happened quietly over years while nobody was really paying attention. Brill was never a grand city. It was a small town, a handful of buildings, a couple of vendors, an inn that smelled like formaldehyde and regret. But for hundreds of thousands of players, Brill was the first place they ever called home. You rolled a Forsaken, crawled out of your grave in Deathnell, stumbled through the tutorial, and then you walked into Brill. It was your first real town, your first mailbox, your first flight path, and for a lot of people, that meant something. Here's the thing about Brill, though. It was already dying the moment you got there. The town sat in the shadow of the Undercity, surrounded by blighted soil and plague-scarred farmland. The Forsaken had claimed it as their primary settlement in Tirisfal Glades, a place where the free-willed undead could exist in something resembling a community. They had apothecaries working on new plagues, death guards patrolling the roads, quest givers sending you out to deal with the scourge remnants still lurking in the countryside. It functioned. Like, it wasn't pretty, but it worked. But as WoW's timeline progressed, Brill got worse. Not in a dramatic, world-shattering way, in a slow, creeping way that most players didn't even register unless they were paying close attention. The blight contamination spread, buildings deteriorated further, NPCs that used to stand in doorways were gone, dialogue shifted from cautious optimism to resignation. The town was being poisoned not by an enemy, but by the Forsaken's own weapons program. And then Battle for Azeroth happened. Sylvanas Windrunner's escalation of blight warfare turned Brill from a struggling settlement into a near uninhabitable toxic zone. The same weapon the Forsaken had developed to protect themselves was now rendering their own territory unlivable. Residents were evacuated or absorbed into the broader Forsaken population. Yeah, the town didn't fall in battle. It didn't burn. It just slowly became a place where even the undead couldn't comfortably exist anymore. What makes Brill's story genuinely sad is how Blizzard chose to tell it. There was no quest chain called The Death of Brill. No cinematic where a named character gives a speech about loss. The story was told entirely through environment, through absence, through the things that used to be there and weren't anymore. You had to notice it yourself. And most people didn't, they'd moved on to Outland or Northrend or wherever the current expansion was pulling them. Brill just quietly rotted in the background, and that's the tragedy distilled to its purest form. The Forsaken were already cursed, they were already dead, they had already lost everything once when the plague destroyed Lordaeron. So they built something new in the wreckage, a small, ugly, functional home in a land that nobody else wanted. And then their own warchief's decisions made even that uninhabitable. You can lose your kingdom to an invading army and call it war. You can lose your life to a magical plague and call it fate. But losing your home because your own leader decided your backyard was a convenient weapons testing ground, that's just bleak. There's no glory in it. No narrative satisfaction, just a small town that got a little worse every year until there was nothing left worth saving, which is, not ideal. But if Brill's quiet death represents the cost of Sylvanas' leadership, what came after her departure might represent something nobody expected. A Golgari's hope, the return of the desolate council. After everything, after the god buried beneath the soil, on the kingdom built on his grave the plague that ate it alive, the prince who murdered his own father, the banshee queen who turned suffering into a weapon, and the blight that poisoned whatever was left. Something genuinely unexpected happened in Tirisfal Glades. Someone tried to fix it. The desolate council emerged during the Shadowlands era as a new governing body for the Forsaken, and it represented something that had never really existed in this region's entire history. A choice. Not a titan's decree, not a king's ambition, not a lich king's domination, an actual collective decision by the undead citizens of Tirisfal to govern themselves, to build something instead of destroying it. Here's the thing. For literally thousands of years, every single power that touched Tirisfal Glades made it worse. Tyr's death cursed the land with latent power that attracted every predator on the continent. Lordaeron's golden age was just a countdown timer to annihilation. Arthas turned it into a graveyard. Sylvanas turned the graveyard into a chemical weapon. Every chapter of this land's story ends the same way. In ash, in plague, in betrayal. And then Lillian Voss and the Desolate Council looked at all of that and said, yeah, we're gonna try anyway. Lillian Voss is a particularly interesting figure here because her entire personal arc mirrors what the council is attempting on a larger scale. She was raised as a weapon, rejected her own undeath, spent years consumed by rage, and eventually chose to stop running from what she was. She's not pretending to be alive. She's not waging war on the living. She's just trying to exist with some dignity in a body that shouldn't still be moving, which is, you know, a pretty reasonable goal for a dead person. The council's mission is straightforward on paper and almost impossibly ambitious in practice. Like, rebuild Forsaken society, reclaim settlements in Tirisfal Glades, create a civilization that isn't defined by the trauma that created it. They're not trying to restore Lordaeron to its former glory. That ship sailed, caught fire, sank, and then the wreckage got blighted. They're trying to build something new on the bones of everything that was lost. And that's what makes this genuinely interesting rather than just a convenient narrative reset. The Desolate Council isn't erasing the horror. They can't. The soil is still poisoned. The Undercity is still a toxic ruin. The population is still, technically dead, but they're choosing to break the cycle anyway. Every previous ruler of Tirisfal treated the land and its people as tools, resources to be spent. The council is the first governing body in this region's history that seems to view its citizens as people worth protecting. The fan community is genuinely split on whether this storyline lands. Some players see it as long overdue redemption for a faction written as villains for too many expansions. Others argue it comes too late, that after the burning of Teldrassil, no amount of council meetings can wash the blood off Forsaken hands. Both sides have a point. That tension is what makes the story worth telling. But here's the open question that Tirisfal Glades leaves us with after 10,000 years of history. Can a land that's been cursed, conquered, plagued, blighted, and abandoned ever actually heal? Can the dead do what the living never could? Nobody knows. The story isn't finished, but for the first time in Tirisfal's entire existence, someone is trying to write a chapter that doesn't end in tragedy, and after everything this land has been through, from a titan sacrifice to an undead council choosing hope over destruction, that might be the most radical thing that's ever happened here. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.